Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Nutrition Radio. We have Anthony Fleck with us one more time. The topics for today, before we do the intros quickly, we've got intuitive eating. If you've heard of that, sort of a emotionally inclusive, weight inclusive, honor your hunger, all these kind of components to that. There is a new meta-analysis, this is breaking nutrition science, on high-intensity interval training on body fat and fat-free mass. We got a weight management tip from Anthony as far as keeping an aerobic base, right? Even when you're trying to make some gains, weight gains. Remember, weight management is also gains. And also a recipe at the end. So having said that, you know that I am Lonnie Lowry. I've been a professor for a long time now, almost 25 years, and I currently consult with the food and the academic industries.
And I am Anthony Fleck, a fitness enthusiast and science enthusiast, and I've just been enjoying the past few weeks, not lifting heavy so much because I've been in the middle of a move, but I'm looking forward to this winter where I can get back at it and eat a lot and lift a lot.
Yeah, it's a good point about moving and stuff like that. I recently blew up my ankle moving furniture. I'm like, oh, come on. It was just like an old surgery thing, right? But it is true. Like when you move, you'll get sore in weird places you didn't know you had, when you're moving furniture and stuff from odd lifts. And
I was thinking about it. I used to kind of scoff and think, I can get my workout in, even though I'm doing this. But I thought about it with all the carrying. I'm carrying, I don't know, maybe 50, 30, 40, 50, 60 pounds in front of me in like a tote. And it's like I'm doing, a loaded carry back and forth all day long. And so, no wonder I'm just blown up here.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's get to our food trend. And I do think this is a trend, something that I've seen crop up occasionally, probably since I was an undergrad.
Market news, food and fitness trends.
But it does evolve, and that is intuitive eating. What do you have here?
Well, I got a little bit out of my depths to begin with, and I had to lean on my wife a bit to keep me updated with all the latest TikTok trends and stuff. And probably about 5 months behind on this one, but there's a concept called girl dinner that's been all over TikTok this summer. And the concept is that it's, people realizing, hey, it's not the end of the world if you just got cravings for little snacky, like foods that you can eat without a utensil. I'm thinking like sit down and eat some chips, some guacamole, some fruit, some cured meats, and maybe some pickles or something like that, or a thing of cheese. Basically a thrown together charcuterie board, right? And that kind of got me thinking, is that, nutritionally speaking, is that a decent meal? And depending on what you put in it, it's not the worst, right? You're getting a few different food groups. You're getting some fiber from the fruits and veggies. You're getting some protein from the meats and cheese, and some carbs and fat and all that. So that got me thinking about the concept of intuitive eating. And Lonnie, you're going to be a lot more familiar about it than I am, but I have a basic understanding that intuitive eating is really learning to be in touch with your body and understand your hunger and the difference between a physical hunger versus just an emotional hunger, and the cravings that you might have, and kind of, some people take it to an extreme and will just say eat whatever you want whenever you want. But I think at its core, it's really more about not trying to diet, but finding a happy and healthy medium, and accepting that when you're hungry, you usually need to eat. But then realizing that when you're not hungry, you don't need to eat, and you can be satisfied and not give in to the cravings every time and things like that. So kind of got me thinking about that as a trend, because I have seen it a lot lately. And I wanted to get your take on what you thought about the intuitive eating approach to health and weight management.
Yeah, that was created by a couple of dietitians years ago. Like I said, I think it's evolved over time, but it is that sort of, to your point, like keeping an ear to the ground as far as emotional eating. I think they co-opt exercise phys, which I'm not sure. I think they need to be careful, at least, with how they do that. reject the diet mentality is part of that. I like that. If you go to intuitiveeating.org, you'll see the two dietitians that I believe are the ones who kind of started the whole idea. I do like, again, reject diet mentality, honor your hunger, make peace with food. The way I've always said that is there is no battle of the bulge. Your body is not battling you. It's doing what all the inputs in your environment are wanting it to do. So if you want your body to do something different, then you need to lead it in a different direction. I understand there are endocrine issues and all that kind of stuff, but challenge the food police. I'm looking at this list of like 10 things on their website. The exercise, feel the difference. Careful, ladies. I don't know where they're going with that, but oftentimes you will see these eating programs involve exercise, and I don't see how exercise is eating, which is why I studied both fields, because they are not the same field. But it talks about like gentle nutrition, honor your hunger, honor your feelings, that kind of stuff. So there's also seems to be, at least one of them was talking about quite a bit of a counseling content. And I also think we need to be careful with scopes of practice. My wife, of course, is a mental health counselor. She's a professional counselor, a therapist. And I think we need to make those referrals and, take a team approach wherever possible and that kind of stuff, because that's some complex stuff.
Good point there. One of the things that stuck out to me is the language that they use in those 10 pillars, whatever you call them, principles. Mm-hmm. It feels very, counselor-y or kind of holistic-y. It's got kind of a softer feel than I think you run into. And maybe softer isn't the right word. Maybe I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It does feel like it kind of breaches that boundary a little bit.
That's the word I thought of when I looked at it too. It's a softer approach, and that doesn't have to necessarily be negative. No, I agree with that. I think it's kind of, challenge the food police. They're trying to do things like limit guilt and, instead of denying the fact that you're hungry or you're emotional or whatever, just acknowledge these things. I mean, it is one of many, many, many diets. We were just talking on the other podcast about all the different, from a biology, everything's biopsychosocial, of course, and from a biology perspective, there's all these different theories of obesity. Whereas this one takes more of that, when we look at biopsychosocial, this is more of like the psychosocial kind of thing. Yes, there's some hunger things, like you said, what is hunger versus appetite, and what's your relationship with food and all that kind of stuff. It does feel a little bit softer to me and a little bit more psychology based, which again is why I think we need to be careful using terms like counseling when there are actually people out there that are counselors. That's just one of those things, being cautious and make a referral where you need to and all that stuff. But
when you've worked with clients in the past, or just seen others that worked with clients, do you typically see or find that a more strict, food journal and tracking approach and, target number of calories or macros, whatever it might be, tends to be pretty effective? Or do you see something like this, a little more of a self-policing, kind of get in touch with yourself approach? Tends to work for people. I mean, do you have any experience with seeing folks use these methods?
Yeah, I've only worked as a nutritionist with university sports teams. Very few. I've worked with very few individual clients over my life. When I have, I've actually taken the stance, I would say, think like a scientist. So it's very hard to control what you don't measure. And so I wouldn't take necessarily this approach, although I do like some things like reject the diet mentality, and that kind of stuff. I would avoid being food police, I suppose, but yeah, I was more like an observe and record kind of guy, because you can deal with that, deal with numbers, and that's going to be more specific and give you more granularity in how you control things, without doing something like, I've never been a huge fan of being a bean counter when it comes to calorie intake, keeping track of macros for shorter term diets and that kind of stuff. But yeah, to your point, I think more science and more observe and record than a lot of this. Not that I would dishonor people's feelings about food or whatever. I mean, obviously behavior is the one thing that I think that nutritionists do better than a lot of exercise science people. Is in exercise science, you do like a safety screening, and then you do some programming, and then you're like, here's your program. You dispense the education and the program as if they're going to follow that. And in nutrition, it's more like, well, what's your readiness to change? on this scale. If people are low readiness to change, you don't just give them a program. They're not going to do it. They're not ready to do it. So you have to kind of emphasize why it's important. Well, what are they going to get out of it? What are the benefits? And there's an element of motivational interviewing and all this other stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you on the a little bit more of a observe and report kind of an approach for myself, at least. I find that I need maybe not hard numbers, but I need to have an idea of where I'm at with things and kind of check in every now and then. I'll kind of go in cycles, track calories or keep an idea on what I'm eating for a few weeks or a month or so, a couple times a year. And then in between there, I just trust that I'm doing all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people who are fitness oriented, you're used to writing down some numbers, like what poundage am I working at this week, and there's just basic things that it's very monitoring intensive. And so when I hear sometimes dietitians over the past, they said, we're going to monitor and this, I'm like, yeah, that's great. But, people from the fitness setting, they already do that. You can't not keep track of some numbers and monitor and assess progress. And so when I see things like exercise, feel the difference. Okay, but that is an entire field that you can get a doctorate in. And so just like with the counseling, I think we need to be careful because these are overlapping scopes of practice. And I'm sure that they would acknowledge that kind of stuff. But because when you exercise, you change yourself from the subcellular level all the way up. You're completely different. That's going to impact your hunger, your sense of fullness, your emotions, your relationship to food, a whole lot of things just because of the exercise part. So making it one of like 10 different principles, I think, is underselling it in a huge way because it affects all these other things in such a huge way, literally making you a different person. So, yeah, that would be something that I would emphasize more so than some of these other things, I guess. Anyway.
We need our whole intuitive exercising guide to go along with it, I guess.
I suppose. Another chance for marketing something, I guess.
There you go.
All right. Now, on the nutrition science and what's breaking there.
Breaking nutrition science.
You mentioned a meta-analysis from earlier this year on high-intensity interval training, on HIIT training.
Yes. So this is, I know, getting more into Iron Radio territory, but I thought with our discussion later and our chat last week about weight gaining season, it would be worth talking a little bit about some exercise topics too, to balance out all that weight gain that I know I will be experiencing. The study title is called The Effect of High Intensity Interval Training Type on Body Fat Percentage, Fat, and Fat-Free Mass, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials. And it's by Kodadati and colleagues, published in March of this year. So not brand new, but pretty darn new. This study took a look at 36 different randomized control trials that each lasted between 3 weeks and 15 weeks, taking a control group and a test group through that period of time where the test group did high-intensity interval training during that time. And they did either outdoor running, treadmill running, or cycling were the three types of exercise that they looked at in all these 36 studies. Okay. And then they measured body fat percentage, fat mass, and fat-free mass using DEXA. I know there's probably maybe a couple methods that might be a little more accurate than DEXA, but I think DEXA is a pretty common, accepted way of measuring these things. And what they found in summary is that HIIT works, and I say works, I mean reduces body fat percentage. They found on average across the three different types of HIIT that they reduced body fat percentage by 1.5% or so. They also they saw that overground running, so outdoor or track running, reduced body fat percent by the highest amount, almost 3% reduction in body fat percentage. But then on the flip side, as far as trying to improve or increase your fat-free mass, so your we'll just call it muscle mass. I know that's a bit reductive, but cycling was the highest increase in fat-free mass was observed with 0.6 kilograms, so right around a pound or so of fat-free mass just from high-intensity interval training, which I thought was encouraging and maybe useful to folks that are trying to gain some strength during this time of the year while keeping some cardio going. So I'll kind of pull the key takeaway for myself here about what they, and I know they're not making a recommendation, but I'm maybe turning it into a non-professional recommendation here, is they said that this analysis of 36 studies suggested that training for more than 8 weeks, at least 3 sessions per week, with the work intervals where you're going all out, less than 60 seconds, separated by less than 90 seconds of active recovery, are the most effective that they observed out of those 36 studies for favorable body composition changes. So that's my takeaway there, is keep at it for at least a couple months, hit it for about 3 sessions a week with work intervals less than 60 seconds with at least a, let's say, 60 to 90 second break in between. They did not give a takeaway as to the length or the number of work sessions altogether, so the length of the whole session. So that's something that maybe you'll have some suggestions. I'm not a big HIIT user, but I might be after this here to save some time in the winter while still keeping my cardio capacity in shape.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the advantage, is that you're not spending hours and hours doing like runs at 60%. I do this now just because of time. For the most part, I'll just get on a bike or an elliptical, and I'll do, usually they're 30 to 60 second all out efforts, or almost all out, and then I'll just pedal or cruise along on the elliptical for maybe 2-3 minutes in between, and then I do it again. I feel like the volume, the number of actual bouts of, let's say, 45-second bouts, I try to start with 4 if I haven't been doing it much lately. And, you're separating it by enough of this active recovery that you're not really exhausted. So go to 4 or 5 of those. That usually takes me about 20 minutes or so. The fun thing is the clock really goes, because I'm not a big aerobic fan. But the clock gets eaten up very quickly because you're always saying, okay, I'm focused on this next 2 to 3 minute, recovery, because I got to go all out again. And so by the time you get through your 4 or 5 of these bouts, you're done. You put in your 20 minutes. Some people like it before they do the weights. Some do it after. I picked up on this years ago, early 2000s. Marty Gibala was a guy that I've met more than once. He's a really nice guy. He's a Canadian. He's McMaster. But they just did a review for the American Journal of Physiology, Cell Physiology. So this is 2022, so not brand new. But they're kind of explaining the whole idea that, you can spend much less total time and get these huge aerobic improvements. What you're talking about, body comp, is very interesting to me, because usually this is about mitochondrial density, more powerhouses in the cell, more capillaries, higher VO2 max, the volume of oxygen you can use. Again, that whole aerobic base. But it would make sense if you have a higher aerobic base, better mitochondrial function, you're going to be a better fat-burning machine. What was interesting when this came out to me was that oftentimes intense stuff, you think, well, that's like, you're using creatine, like phosphagen fuels, you're using some glycolysis and carbohydrates and stuff like that. So how do you become such a better fat-burning machine? But it's those those rest, active rest intervals in between the bouts that really help. I mean, it's like that's an aerobic kind of stimulus. So it's just neat that you could do something explosively anaerobic. And because of those interspersed aerobic recovery portions, you're actually getting much better mitochondrial function. I think once I read something like 13% better mitochondrial function in as little as 2 weeks doing this kind of stuff. So imagine becoming a 13% better fat burner in 2 freaking weeks. And so that appealed to me because I didn't have the time or the inclination to do tons and tons of cardio. It's just kind of neat that, in a very brief 20 minutes total time, I can get similar results. Let's say somebody was running at a more moderate pace, slow, steady, continuous, maybe for an hour a couple of times a week or whatever it might be. This says recent work suggests training for more than 6 weeks improves VO2 max in part by increasing maximal cardiac output, expanding blood volume, increased capillary density and mitochondrial density, blah, blah, blah. So it's the usual. This is the usual stuff that I'm used to. And this, like I said, this is just one of the more recent reviews. But what you're sharing there is very cool on the body comp side. It's curious that cycling is not weight bearing in the same way that running would be. But, you can get a burn in the quads. I'm betting some of the DEXA results, they showed enhancements, especially in the lower body, because of the local effects on your quads when you're pedaling and that kind of stuff. The resistance would be there.
Yeah, they answered, I shouldn't say answered that question. They posed that question as well, because I don't know if they were surprised, but they noted the difference was maybe a bit unexpected and threw out some potential mechanisms, but didn't answer any of those questions in this study.
I would say listeners should think about, if you're going to do a bike, you're going to have to think about, do I pedal more slowly with a heavier resistance? Because if you're after the fat-free mass, that might be what you do. Like I like to put the bike on level 10 and just pedal at like 60 RPMs. Yes, the RPMs are going to go up during these bouts, but I guess my point is, what's your sweet spot between RPMs on the bike and weight? Because, those are the two things that you can do to get the intensity high, more resistance or faster pedaling. Mm-hmm. And so people are going to have to come up with a sweet spot. And I remember hearing years and years ago that people that are strength athletes, they tend to choose lower RPMs and more resistance. That's where they're comfortable. Whereas people who are thin and very aerobic oriented, they'll lighten the load and pedal faster. That makes sense to me. I suppose.
I think that makes perfect sense. I was just going to chime in and say, we've got a bike in our an indoor bike in our basement that I've been using this year, and I find that if I go low resistance, high pedal speed, my lungs get gassed, but my legs are hardly, they feel like they're hardly working. Whereas if I crank up the weight, my lungs get pretty tired, but I start to feel, not just my quads, not just my hamstrings, but every muscle in my leg is exhausted by the time I get off that bike, which, maybe, I don't know if it's better for outcomes or not, but it's what I'm trying to get out of it. So that's what I usually end up doing.
And I think the more skilled you get on a bike, you pull with your hamstrings on the back arc. It's not just quads, it's the whole thing all the way around. That level 10 kind of stuff I'm talking about when I do steady state with a lower RPM, when I would do, everybody's going to be different, right? But when I do the interval stuff, I'll fluctuate. I'll keep the RPMs fairly low, actually, but I'll just go from like a, level 5 to level 18 on the bike, whether I'm recovering or, hitting it harder. Or on an elliptical, I do like level 5 versus level 17 or 18 or whatever. So everybody's going to have to come up with that kind of resistance thing. But this is going to play into our conversation later when it comes to keeping up an aerobic base when you're trying to gain weight, because nobody wants to spend hours and hours out jogging when they're trying to gain weight. Like that's not going to be super helpful for the most part, running and jogging and that kind of stuff. I mean, our options have always been HIIT training like this, or maybe literally just a walk. But I think that's where we're going to go next, right? So weight management tip here was about maintaining that aerobic base. So I know you have a couple of things here as well.
Weight management tips.
So as a follow up to last week, where I gave tips about gaining weight and trying to do it quickly, I think it's important to still keep that aerobic base around. It's easy to say, I'm trying to gain weight. I don't want to burn calories doing cardio, but I think for most people, for the average person, it's also worth considering, lifelong implications and things like that. And keeping that aerobic base and that cardio will not only help, with lifelong health and reduction in mortality, but also it gives you that base you need to complete your strength training. It helps you, make it up the stairs when you're 20 pounds heavier.
Right.
And I think there's something to just always keeping that in your routine, because it's a lot harder, in my opinion, right? I gravitate towards weights. I think that's fun. That's what is fulfilling to me. So if I get out of the habit of doing cardio, it takes a long time for me to rebuild that habit. And so it's just easier for me to just keep it in there, even if that's, like we just talked about there, high intensity interval training, or maybe it's just doing kettlebell swings in between my sets of something else that I'm working on, just to keep something that keeps me breathing heavy going. I think is a really valuable thing to keep in your routine as you're gaining weight and strength and mass. To myself, that's important, but I also went out there to look, because I know people have been concerned about the effects of cardio, stealing your gains, right? Or even thinking about, well, cardio means I'm going to have to eat more to keep gaining weight, right? So I did pull a couple papers that are out there just to take a peek at how does cardio interact with weight gain and strength and all that, and health overall. I found a couple just headlines, and I don't want to get into the papers because we could spend an hour going over each of these.
Right.
I took a look at one paper that looked at the effect of HIIT training again on lean mass, strength, and power of the lower limbs in healthy old and young people. So they had two groups, one that was in their 60s and one that was in their early 20s. And with HIIT training over the course of 12 weeks, they found increases in lean mass and strength, which I thought was pretty encouraging for someone who might be worried about strength loss doing cardio.
Yep.
I pulled a study that looked directly at concurrent aerobic and strength training for skeletal muscle size and function. So it was actually a meta-analysis that looked at all these other studies that were out there. And just reading from their conclusions, this was published in 2021 by Schumann and colleagues. Explosive strength gains may be attenuated, so explosive strength specifically, but muscle hypertrophy and maximal strength development were not compromised as a result of concurrent aerobic training. So you'll still get your big muscles and your strength. You just may lose out a little bit on explosive strength. And then lastly, this is published on Science Daily. This is just a review or a summary of an article that was published. I couldn't get to the full text because it was behind the paywall for me. But these researchers just took a look at walking and found that they quantified. So this was published just this year, October 26th, just a couple days ago. 8,000 steps a day reduce the risk of premature death. They actually did in this study take a look at different step counts per day and their impact on cardiovascular disease. And they found that 8,000 steps a day is kind of the sweet spot, we'll say. So it's pretty close to that 10,000 step number that people have floated for a while, but they actually did some research to really quantify that. But they said even just a couple thousand steps a day starts showing cardiovascular and reduction in mortality benefits. So just thinking long-term, lifelong health here, fitness is a lifelong journey. I think it's really worth keeping that in your routine. So this is maybe not a tip, maybe it's just a plug. Me just trying to get everyone out there to keep their cardio in their routine.
Yeah, I used to encourage football linemen to walk because I didn't want them doing endless cardio outside of practice, especially when they were practicing like 2 a day and all this crazy intense volume stuff. But I'm like, how about you just do some fasted walking, essentially, before breakfast and kind of thing, an old bodybuilder trick, just so they could get in some steps, right? Because, those guys, a lot of them are obese. They don't have, let's just say, optimal like cardiometabolic, factors working in their favor. So we would do that kind of stuff. If the coach is like, Lonnie, can you get some weight off of these guys? I'm like, well, that would be my approach. You can't have them train even more. Obviously, there's some dietary things that they could be doing. But yeah, manipulating diet with exercise and getting in some steps like that, I think is good, especially because if you're heavy, walking puts you at a higher percentage of your heart rate max. It kind of gets you into that training zone faster than you'd think because you're heavy. You're doing a lot of work. You're moving a lot of mass, whether you're a lineman or even just somebody who's, basically overweight or obese. It does help. It's cool what you're saying about the dose. Like, here's an optimal, like a regression equation, like where on the line, where on the slope of the success line can we point, like an inflection point. And
exactly.
If 8,000, that sounds really good. A little bit less, like you said, than the usual 10,000 steps a day. But your point about just adding a few thousand, that's really the way to go. Because if your baseline is 3, then 10 would be folly, right? You can't set a goal like that.
Right.
But adding maybe 2,000 or 3,000 over what you normally do, that makes a lot of sense to me. Walking is such a low intensity thing, so long as your ankle isn't blown out, then you can go, it doesn't require a lot of instruction and all that kind of stuff. It's not nearly as pounding as running. I actually think running is really hard on the body, long distance running. Depends on how much you weigh and a lot of other things, I imagine. But yeah, HIIT and walking would be where I would lean instead of something like long, half marathons, stuff like that. Yeah. We're running at 70, 80% pace and just beating yourself up.
If that's your goal, or if that's the type of cardio you really enjoy, more power to you. But I think if that's not your goal and not the type of cardio you really enjoy, there's no need to force yourself to do something like that. There's other options here, like HIIT or walking, that are good for you and will reap probably more rewards in the end because you'll actually stick with them.
Yeah, and I do think that at some point you are going to do too much aerobic stuff and it will hamper your gains. Like the earlier stuff I saw, a lot of military stuff, but those guys are really pounding, overtraining, kind of, we got to, less strength gains or whatever it might be. And I know you were talking about reduced power improvements, but at some level, well, it depends on the level. Like I usually say, I want to compete in bodybuilding. So I don't want to look like a wrestler. Wrestlers are muscular. They look good, but I want to look like a bodybuilder. And that meant being very heavy without too much cardio. But to your point, there have been times in my life where I fell back so much, like I was doing negatives, which isn't very metabolically demanding, slow lowering of the weight for the listeners. I would do minimal sets. That would be what my buddy Phil says, you're a tissue assassin. All you want to do is get sore. Yeah. And then I would leave the gym, and that kind of eccentric exercise is very hypertrophy inducing. But my cardio base would just suck, We used to joke about my VO2 max when I was in grad school was 33, which is like crippled, not good, and partly that was because I was quite heavy and not doing all that cardio. And then as I got older, like you said, it's a lifelong thing. I started thinking there's no reason I can't do some. And that's why I would do the occasional HIIT stuff on a bike for 15 or 20 minutes, or, get out there and walk, hikes, stuff like that. Because I don't think that that's going to interfere with, muscle gain and stuff like that. So it's good to have numbers and stuff.
If you're going to add HIIT into your routine, you better be prepared to add a shower after the HIIT if you're planning on going to bed or doing anything else.
Yeah. It's intense. I mean, that's the idea. Right on. All right. And then lastly, this week, and this is the last week we'll have you, chickpeas as a meal in a pinch. So kind of a recipe here, or is this just a tip for a snack?
Rant, product review, or recipes?
A little bit of both. Every now and then, I work from home, and so I'll mosey over to the fridge and take a look inside, and maybe we don't have much for leftovers or things that are prepared or easily, grab and go items. Or maybe I just don't have a lot of time on my hands. And so what I've started doing is keeping a can of chickpeas or garbanzo beans around. And I prefer to keep canned rather than dry, just because they're already cooked and hydrated and ready to go. Mm-hmm. I'll take and drain the can, throw it in a pan with some olive oil. It takes a little while. They're pretty wet, so it takes a while for them to kind of dry out and brown up. So I'll usually go out, throw them in a pan, and then walk away and just listen. And you can kind of hear when they start to, kind of transition from being saturated with water to actually starting to fry up. You'll hear the pan popping a little bit, and I get them kind of browned up, and then I will put a little garlic or salt, pepper, whatever other seasonings you might be interested in. They kind of can take on whatever flavor you give them. They really don't have a lot of flavor to begin with by themselves. And then usually I almost always have yogurt around the house. So I'll take some yogurt and some lemon juice and mix that up, maybe with a little dill, kind of make almost like a tzatziki sauce, I guess.
Okay.
And drizzle that over top. And I'll make a bowl and just make a meal out of a can of garbanzo beans and a little bit of yogurt. Because if you really think about it, nutritionally, that's a pretty decent meal.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 600 calories or so. The garbanzo beans themselves will have 20-something grams of fiber, so you might have some stomach discomfort if you're sensitive to that. There will be some fat from the olive oil you used, and maybe a little from the beans themselves and the yogurt. The yogurt will add a little bit extra protein, although the beans have a fair amount as well. I mean, I think it probably totals out at around 40 or so grams of protein in the meal.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you care about this, you're getting some active cultures, some probiotics, right? You're getting kind of a variety of different things and some micronutrients in there as well. Heck, if you you could chop up some parsley and sprinkle that over top, or some sort of a green. If you had some spinach around or something, that could go right over top as well and just kind of blend in. And it's pretty palatable. It's pretty tasty for basically what's just a can of beans with some seasoning.
Right. Yeah. Because of the protein and the fiber, beans have always been attractive. They're very, very low glycemic index, right? These things do not exactly spike your blood sugar. And that's a good thing for a lot of people. Did you have to work your way up to that amount? Like, did you start with a third of a can? Or were you able to just, not get too gassy and stuff by going for a whole can out of the gate? Or how do you do that?
Well, like I mentioned, I work from home, so it's not, the consequences are pretty limited to just me. So I don't worry too much about it. There have been times where if I'll sit down and eat a whole can of those, or sometimes I'll do something similar with black beans. I'll just drain a can of black beans and throw some salsa over it and call it a meal. I haven't done that for a while, but either of those will sometimes give me a little gas or discomfort, uncomfortable, but really not too bad for me. Typically it's not a problem. Yeah.
It's probably individual as well. I mean, if you routinely get enough fiber and especially bean products and that kind of stuff, I'm just trying to be as cautious as possible with people jumping into this. We used to do a lab where I would literally demonstrate. We would just do like a little glucose tolerance curve with an apple and half a can of red beans versus the equivalent grams of carbs in white bread. And the area under the curve is so low, like your blood sugar barely moves with the apple and the beans. And with the white bread, of course, it's spiking by 30 to 60 minutes, and I think that's Americans' problem. We were talking about it's definitely not the only reason for obesity, like a lot of people get into, a lot of the keto people and everything. But there is a problem in this country with these repeat blood sugar spikes and all that kind of stuff. People eating fiberless, refined flours, white flours and stuff. And it's a real problem. But I used to go with half a can of beans and an apple instead of a whole can of beans, just because I was always worried about. I didn't want anybody saying, "Oh, I feel so bloated," and and that kind of stuff. So I imagine there's difference.
Makes a lot of sense.
And people there's Beano. I mean, there are different enzyme products out there that you can have if you're going to try to up the volume of what you're doing with that kind of stuff as well. It's almost like Lactaid tablets before you drink milk if you're lactose intolerant. Same thing with this. You can take Beano or something related like that, enzymes to help you break down stachyose and raffinose and all those carbohydrates in beans that your body's like, I can't do that right now. I can't do that much right now. But anyway.
Yeah, you could cut down on the amount of beans and mix in a rice or a quinoa or something like that would go well with it. And and then it would maybe balance out. Maybe you'd get a little bit of a quicker hit of some, maybe a little spike of blood sugar to get you going, and then the fiber in there as well would keep everything from going too crazy.
Yeah, I think a lot of sports drinks are like that too. They'll do like a carb blend. Some are fast, some are medium, some are slow, so you can get this kind of sustained energy release kind of deal.
And nice thing with the beans too, it's $1 or $2 a can, so it's not a terribly expensive meal. If you've got them laying around, it's easy to get to. And you could eat them raw too. You don't have to cook them up. I just prefer the texture and flavor. Yeah.
No, good point. Dirt cheap. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always remember, I think, what's his name, a guy on YouTube, Scooby. He's an older bodybuilder that's kind of mentored a lot of younger people. And when I was kind of learning things, I watched his channel, and he always talked about keeping a couple cans of beans in the back of his car. So he always had something. It maybe isn't the most palatable, but you can stomach it down if you're in a pinch and you're traveling and you need something. And that kind of always stuck with me. And so I've always kept them, not in the car, but just in the house. I always keep some around.
There has been some concern over the years that beans, some more than others, can have certain levels of anti-nutrients, things that interfere with the absorption of this or that, but that's usually sort of minor in comparison to what you're talking about. Like if you have a healthy diet, what you need to focus on is, that the fiber, the protein. Mixing beans with grains might even be a better approach as far as, not being low on any one of those necessary, indispensable amino acids. Grains lack lysine, beans lack methionine, but they cover each other's back. So, I think what I might do is, just because I am kind of sensitive, the chickpeas and black beans especially hit me pretty hard. So I think I might mix in, like you said, some quinoa, some brown rice. There's lots of things that you could kind of toss in there. And they even have, those 90-second kind of things where you can just put a brown rice in the microwave for, if you're not against that kind of stuff. But it's a cool idea. And it's the kind of thing that corrects a lot of Americans' problem, right? We don't get enough fiber. Even though we might get enough protein, it's usually not from something like this. It's from low-quality, greasy fast food meats and stuff like that. So that's a good one.
If that's the difference between not eating and getting a decent meal, or not eating and getting,
Absolutely.
What would I be grabbing from the freezer or something instead? It's pretty darn good, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and protein's the most expensive thing that you can buy in the grocery store. I mean, if you don't believe Anthony and everybody, go look. Eggs are a pretty good deal, although they've been much more expensive in recent times. But I would always look for, what are some of these things? Cans of tuna, cans of salmon. Like, how can you actually get these lower cost proteins? And here's one. Right? What you're talking about. Here's super duper cheap. Because a lot of people would say, well, I can't afford to eat healthy. Yeah, you can. You just have to give it some thought and talk to someone, brainstorm for ideas. Right? And, chickpeas would be one of them. It's
if you're really looking to save money, get them dried and rehydrate them yourself. It will be $1 or $2 for a 2-pound bag of them. And that'll go a long way.
Right on. Yeah. I thought about that too. As I'm looking forward to traveling a lot and trying to retire early and all this stuff, I'm thinking bag of beans, bag of dry rice. That's going to last forever, right? Mm-hmm. For peanuts, it's funny, for very low cost. That's good for financial, and I think missing nutrients in a lot of people's diets. You'd instantly increase your diet quality on the week if you could just make a can of garbanzo beans disappear, I would think. Especially because you're talking about adding other good stuff on there, like yogurt with some probiotics. All right. Well, wow. That is the month of October. I just wanted to say thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great time.
Everybody, we have one more guest planned to round out 2023. At that point, we're going to decide if we're going to keep going with this kind of stuff. But having said that, it's great to actually check in with guys like Anthony, people who can bring some of these good ideas to the table. Whether you're a consumer or a company looking for innovation or whatever, these are interesting ideas about how people try to, improve diet quality or keep up on breaking science trends, all the things that we talk about. So I'm grateful that we get some people like Anthony to come on. So having said that, I guess we will say goodbye until next week.
The nutritionradio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.